Hello. I've been looking at one of the most famous buildings in the world. It's called the Parthenon, and it was put up by the ancient Greeks over 2,000 years ago. Have you ever seen anything like it? You may well have done, because the Parthenon has been much admired, and when people admire something, they tend to copy it.
Usually they just copy the front, the tall columns, and the triangular-shaped piece at the top. Perhaps there's something like this in your hometown.
The Parthenon is not a bank or a town hall. It's a temple, a bit like a church or a mosque. But it wasn't put up in honour of a Christian god or a Muslim god. It was put up by the Greeks in honour of the goddess Athene. The Greeks believed in many different gods. And just down the hill from the Parthenon was a temple to Hephaestus. Just down here. Hephaestus was the god of craftsmen and blacksmiths.
On the other side of the hill, there was a temple to Zeus, the king of the gods. It was a fine temple, but it wasn't as grand as the temple of Athene, because Athene was very special to the people who lived here. They even named their city after her. They called it Athens. Today, Athens is a huge modern city, but its centre is still the Parthenon, standing on the rocky hill known as the Acropolis. This is where the Athenians chose to build the greatest of all their temples. Today, some bits of the Acropolis are being restored, and the modern Athenian builders are using much the same tools as the men who worked on the original Parthenon. Just as in ancient times, they're using hammer and chisel to knock the marble into shape. And the heavy blocks of stone are still raised and lowered into position by pulleys. The workmen still use scaffolding and ladders when they want to work higher up the wall. And they still have much the same way of carrying away the unwanted stones and rubble. The workmanship is beautiful. And one of the most remarkable things about it is that there is no cement in the Parthenon. So what is it that holds the columns together?
Each block has a strut in the middle to hold the next one in place. A bit like this. And the workmanship is so good that all the joins are absolutely smooth. In fact, you can hardly see them. Just look at that. the design looks simple, it's not. It seems to be all straight lines and right angles. But is it? Well, take these columns, for example. They've been made to slope slightly inwards. And if you look carefully, you can see it. It's little touches like this that make the temple seem so light and elegant. Why don't you try making a temple? You may be a bit short on blocks of marble, but it's amazing what you can do with a bit of ingenuity and an awful lot of detergent packets.
It took the ancient Greeks 20 years to build the Parthenon, but these children are hoping to finish the job a bit quicker. They used detergent packets for the base, for the roof, and the inner walls.
How's that, Claire? It's good. I think it's going to look terrific.
And they made the steps by cutting out strips of corrugated cardboard. David is cutting one of the packets into 2 triangular shapes. Any idea what that's for? It's to give the temple a sloping roof.
That looks good. Now all we need to is cover it. And put pillars in.
Yes, very impressive. It may not last as long as the Parthenon, but it's something they can be really proud of. And once you've built your temple, you should do as the ancient Greeks did and decorate it. When the Parthenon was first put up, much of it was painted, and the front was covered in sculpture. The sculpture told the story of how Athene was born, and it happened in a very unusual way. Zeus, the king of the gods, had been complaining about a headache for a long time. He went on and on about it until Hephaestus finally picked up an axe and split Zeus's skull open. A rather drastic solution, but it did the trick, for no sooner had he split open the skull than out popped a fully grown Athene. No wonder Zeus had a headache.
The sculpture at the western end told the story of how Athene invented the olive tree. Athene was the goddess of wisdom, and to the Greeks this was the cleverest thing she ever did, because the olive tree produces these precious things: olives. They're food, you can eat them, but probably more important, they can be squeezed to produce a liquid. Can you see it oozing out? And if you squeeze enough of them, you get one of these, a bottle of olive oil. I expect some of you have seen this in your kitchens at home. This is what the Greeks used instead of butter. They used it for cooking and for cleaning themselves with, a bit like soap, and for fueling their lamps. And to this day, Greece and the neighbouring countries are covered in olive trees. whatever olive tree, the one that Athene herself created, was said to have sprung up on the Acropolis. And that's the reason why she's always been connected with the city. Just as St. Andrew is the patron saint of Scotland, and St. George is the patron saint of England, so Athene became the patron goddess of Athens. And in her honour, they put up not just temples, but great statues.
The most famous statue of all was inside the Parthenon. It was over 10 metres high and covered in gold and ivory. As always, the goddess was shown with helmet and shield, and in the centre of the shield there was a strange face, the head of a woman with snakes writhing in her hair. It was the Gorgon, Medusa.
Who were the Gorgons? Who was Medusa? And what was her head doing on Athena's shield? Well, the Greeks loved a good tale, and this is one of the best of all their stories.
It began with a chest, a large wooden chest at the edge of the sea. Strange, thought the fisherman. He was used to old wine jars being thrown up by the waves, bits of broken ore, that sort of thing. But not wooden chests like this one. Could it be that it contained treasure? Excitedly, he began to break into the chest with his broad knife. And yes, as the wood broke, yes, there was the gleam of gold. But it was gold on a woman's dress, and the gold of the hair of the baby she was carrying. For in the chest, amazingly, was a mother weeping with joy because once more she could see the sky, a mother and her sleeping child. And that's how Perseus and his mother Danae came to that Greek island. The waves brought them. Danae had an astonishing tale to tell, first to the fisherman, and then to the king of the island, a man called Polydectes. Where they'd come from, she told him, they'd innocently caused a powerful man to fear them, and he'd shut them into the wooden darkness of that box and had them thrown into the cruel sea. But the cruel sea had been kind. And so Danae and her son lived in the palace, and as the years went by, Perseus grew into a strong young man, a marvellously strong and fearless young man, which was just as well, because Polydectes wanted to marry Danae against her will. Alone, she would not have dared to resist him, but she had Perseus to protect her, and with Perseus at her side, no man could make her do what she did not wish to do. Polydectes saw that he must rid himself of the troublesome youth, so he called his friends together, and Perseus was among them. "I have plans to marry," said the cunning king, and he named, no, not Danae, but another lady, a princess from another island. "If I am to impress her father, I must take him a present of a herd of horses. I ask you then to each give me a marriage gift of a horse." They said yes, and yes, and yes, until it came to Perseus, and Perseus had to say that he had no horses, and nothing with which to buy a horse. But perhaps the king would care to name some other gift that Perseus could afford. "Of course," said Polydectes, and his eyes grew cloudy with cunning. "I name the head of Medusa." Medusa. She was one of the 3 terrible sisters, the Gorgons. She had snakes for hair and huge crooked teeth. Her tongue lolled out between her lips, and when anyone looked into her dreadful eyes, they were instantly turned to stone. As he left the palace, he was close to despair. He couldn't say no. First, because he'd asked Polydectes to name a gift, and then because he was not the man to say no to any adventure, however dangerous. But to this adventure, he saw no hope of a happy ending. But help was at hand. Athene, the goddess of wisdom, appeared before him, and she had with her magic gifts. A sword with an edge like that of no mortal sword. A helmet that once he put it on would make him invisible. Winged sandals for the long flight to where the Gorgons lived. And finally, most important of all, Athene's own brilliantly polished shield. If he didn't look directly at Medusa, she said, but looked only at the shield's reflection, he'd be safe. "And where shall I find Medusa?" asked Perseus. "That," said the goddess, "is a secret known only to the 3 Grey Sisters. That must be your first task, to seek them out and force them to tell you." The 3 Grey Sisters lived far away in a desolate wilderness. As Perseus approached, he saw what seemed to be 3 blind, toothless old hags. And then he noticed that they were not quite blind and not quite without teeth, for they had between them a single eye and a single tooth, which they passed from one to another whenever it was needed. As he watched, he saw what he must do. Swooping silently down, he seized the eye from them. "You may have the eye back," said Perseus, "but only if you tell me where to find the Gorgons." The 3 sisters gibbered and squeaked in rage, but in the end, they had to agree to the bargain. The secret was revealed, the eye was returned, and Perseus sped triumphantly off to the Gorgons. He heard them before he saw them, the hissing of those terrible snakes. He raised the shield until he was looking only at the reflection of the scene below. A strange sight met his eyes. Why around the sisters were there so many men and animals? How did they dare to live so close to those fatal eyes? And then he saw that they were all as still as stone. They were stone. They were all victims of the Gorgons. Now he saw in the clear face of the shield that the sisters were sleeping. Now he could see Medusa herself, and now the sound of his wings was like that of a sword cutting through the air. And then there was the sound of that too. As he banked away and leapt high into the air, he thrust the awful head into the bag. The other sisters were awake. They were ready to pursue him. He could hear their angry cries. Now he had on his helmet and was invisible. And now he was on his way home again. Or was he? How could he know that other adventures, just as terrible, lay ahead?
And what happened to Perseus after that? Well, you'll have to wait to find out till next week. Goodbye.
Heroes of old, heroes of Greece, heroes of legend whose fame will never cease. Theirs is the glory, a never-ending story. Praise to the heroes of Greece. Heroes of old, heroes, heroes, heroes of ancient Greece.